All right, well, my name's Noell. I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you about exposure management in AWS, how it's a little different than traditional environments, and how it's actually easier in AWS in some ways, and some of the opportunities that you can take advantage of. So let's start out with the definition. Exposure's not necessarily the most common term. Basically, there are two types of security issues that companies face. One are exposures. What are the weaknesses within my environment that a hacker could potentially compromise and could lead to the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of my environment or the data in my environment. Then there's the other side of detection and protection against those attacks that compromise those exposures. And I use the term exposure instead of vulnerability because vulnerabilities become such a loaded term in the security space and often means something much more specific than what I'm talking about. I'm really talking about any type of weakness that exposes your data and your environment to compromise. So obviously an important topic, obviously something that no one wants to happen to them. So how do you go about doing it? And before we get into that, let's talk about the types of exposures that are out there. There's the obvious type that everybody thinks of, the things that traditional network vulnerability scanners have found for years, the patch issues, the misconfigurations on individual systems, the cipher strength issues that people encounter. These are certainly very important. The last year has shown us that these vulnerabilities are still out there and still used to compromise environments. Things like shell shock and Heartbleed made headlines last year and certainly caused many organizations grief. So don't mean to trivialize those at all, but that's really just the beginning of this journey. There's also network architecture issues. So if you allow too much access inbound or outbound to your environment, that becomes more surface area that you can be attacked from. If you have things like a database that can talk out directly to the internet, that's not something that anybody intentionally designs, but we see it all too often in real network architectures. So how do you find those things and eliminate them from your environment becomes very important. Some other types of exposures. As you start to consume cloud services, those cloud services can be configured in a secure way, or they can be configured in an insecure way. Many of these services are incredibly flexible to meet all the different use cases that someone needs to employ them for. But with that flexibility comes complexity, and it's easy to make mistakes. So it's important to understand whether your services are configured in a secure way. And finally, there are permissioning issues. You can have too many users that have access to an environment. Those users can have too much privilege. Any of those accounts can become a route to compromise. Likewise, the systems themselves and their accounts, the IAM roles that they assume, can be overprivileged, and that can lead to compromise. So you can start to see that exposure management is a multi-factor type of problem to go solve. You have to think about it from the perspective of problems on a specific instance, patch issues, configuration issues, problems with specific services, problems with the network, and finally problems with the people who have access to those and the accounts that have access to those. So that really gets you through the definition and types. Next thing I want to talk about is, so if you're an organization that's been doing this for a while, how are you typically going about doing it? How are you typically going about exposure management? Well, traditionally there have been really two things that organizations do. They do regular vulnerability scanning, because vulnerability scanning is cheap and easy, almost free to exercise as often as you want. And then they supplement that with annual security assessments. And these annual security assessments may look like pen tests, they may look like reviews of user permissions. All the factors I talked about under exposure management should really be comprehended in these. But once a year's not really a lot to be looking at something that, if you have that exposure for an instant, it could potentially be compromised. But traditionally we've only done them that way because it's really expensive and a manual process to go about doing those types of assessments. So how does AWS really change the game here? Well, at AWS, we have programmatic access to the entire infrastructure. Everything is an API, which means that everything can be tracked through services like config and CloudTrail, So for the very first time, getting any information about the state of my environment is a describe API call away, a config review away, or a CloudTrail log away. Having all this information at my fingertips now gives me the opportunity for the very first time to understand what the state of my environment is and to move away from this very reactive, once a year look at exposure management, and now start to look at it on even an event basis. Start to see when a change happens, whether that change is opening up a vulnerability or whether in fact that change is okay and leaving my environment in a secure state. And then I can react to that immediately before harm's done, as opposed to waiting for that to be discovered in a once a year audit exercise. Second opportunity that it opens up is not only can I know about it sooner and react sooner, I can react in a more intelligent way. If you've looked at traditional vulnerability scanning reports, they tend to be about that thick for a large environment. You tend to find 5 to 10 issues with every host on your network. If you have a network of 100 or 1,000 instances, then that starts to add up to thousands of findings. Managing thousands of anything and trying to distribute that work and track it to completion, and then do it again when the next set of vulnerabilities comes out and is discovered, is a pretty daunting task. But in reality, especially in cloud infrastructures where you're likely to be deploying things in an automated, regular fashion, you have the ability to start to look for patterns in the data. You're probably not deploying every instance as its own unique snowflake. You're deploying, in the case of a lot of customers, a pre-baked artifact, an AMI, a golden image, that has all the software already on it. And so what I really want to do is, regardless of whether that software is deployed to 1 instance or 100, I want to look for that pattern, which piece of software has the issue, and then I want to go fix that AMI and redeploy it. The fact that there were 100 instances doesn't matter. That becomes part of my continuous deployment process to deploy the new version over it. So it's really no more work, regardless of how many instances I have out there, if I can see the pattern in the data. It's a problem that current tools don't necessarily solve, because current tools are used to this perspective where every instance is important. What really becomes important in the cloud world is what piece of software am I deploying, and can I identify the piece of software that has that defect, replace it, and then get it distributed out to the single instance, tens of instances, or hundreds of instances that software is deployed on. So that's really the second opportunity that we have with AWS, is we have the ability to spot those patterns much easier than we could in a traditional enterprise, and leverage the relationships that the data has to identify what the root cause of the issue is and then go address that root cause. So the third opportunity that we have is, because in the cloud more people are moving to a continuous deployment process, why do I need to wait for a vulnerability to make it all the way into production? Why don't I sort of back up a step and deal with it early on in the deployment process? So many people actually deploy their new code to a staging environment, run it through a battery of integration tests, and then deploy it in an automated fashion to production if it passes those integration tests. Another set of tests you can run against it are security tests. You can identify whether there's a failing at that level, and then never promote to production if there's a failing. You fail the builds, the developer sees the problem, developer fixes the problem, redeploys, and now you end up with secure code in production versus a vulnerability that has to be remediated after the fact and leaves you open to a window of exposure. So the last thing I want to talk about is a final opportunity with AWS is, as you start to think about the relationships in your network, not every exposure is created equal. Some exposures are exploitable from the internet. Some are buried multiple layers deep in your network. Everything else being equal, I probably care about the ones that are exploitable from the internet far more than I do the ones that only an insider would have access to. So, because again, everything in my environment, including the network, is defined programmatically, I can actually identify those relationships and use that as a prioritization mechanism to focus on the things that really matter and deprioritize the exposures that are buried within the network. Not to say that I never want to fix them, but to say that those are lower priorities, and if I only have a certain amount of time, I'm going to focus on the things that expose me to the most risk. So that becomes an important capability that we've really never had in the past, and that progressive tools like Cloud Insight are starting to make available to customers, is the ability to see those network relationships and to start to prioritize based on them. One more point I'll make. I said that was the final point, but I lied. As we start to get deeper into the relationships, one of the things that we've seen with some of our customers is it also matters how these things chain together. So if I have a typical multi-layer network where I've got the internet out here, I've got an ELB, I've now got multiple web servers, and back here I have RDS or DynamoDB as my data store. What we've seen in some cases is someone has a significant remotely exploitable vulnerability like shell shock that allows me into the web server, and then that web server has over-provisioned IAM roles that give you access to do anything and on any table in your data store. This is an exposure, this is an exposure. Both of them are serious exposures. What I really would like to see as a customer is the fact that I've got this chain of exposures that leads me to a very dark place where someone can remotely exploit me and then read any data I have, drop tables, maybe put me out of business depending on what my business is. If I can see that, then I can act on it. It puts me in a much different posture. Today in most tools, this is something I see with my vulnerability scanner. This is something I may deduce from my own analysis of my IAM roles, but I don't really have the ability to put those things together, so that you're going to have to get kind of lucky with a network or system administrator, a developer within your business who sort of intuitively understands the relationships here and can say, oh my gosh, this could be exploited. You know, what we're doing is starting to put this picture together and serve it up as a network diagram with the vulnerabilities laid over it, so that you can start to see how these things chain together in a way that goes beyond sort of simple thresholding and traditional scoring like CVSS scores, which are fine and good as far as they go. This is important and this is important, but lose the richness of the data and the fact that the relationship of these vulnerabilities leads me to a place where I could be put out of business. So with that, I promised that it was going to be the last point. I then kept going. What questions do you guys have, or comments?
What's a common, vulnerability with exposure that maybe people aren't aware of? Is it something like this, or?
So the question was, what's a common vulnerability or exposure that people aren't aware of? So, I think certainly the chaining of these things is one aspect of it. What we're seeing is there's a certain familiarity with the traditional instance-based vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, because to the extent people have been doing any security over the years, they've been dealing with that. It's really when you get into the service vulnerabilities, how do I configure IAM roles in a secure fashion? How do I configure security groups and network ACLs in a secure fashion? Simple enough to do once, simple enough to set up maybe a very simple application, but over time trying to analyze what you've done, especially if multiple people are involved, especially as the application grows more complex, gets to be pretty difficult. If you've ever tried to build a network diagram to understand the relationships of what all those security groups you've set up actually allow in and out of the environment, it takes some time. It's not a trivial thing, and it's easy to make mistakes because they're so flexible and it's powerful, but it's complex. So that's probably the biggest thing we see, is just these complex services and trying to understand what's actually been implemented in the production environment and whether it's what I intended or not. We've actually seen some networks where people have wide open gateways that allow access on any port and any service to anything within the network. And then unfortunately, they have a gateway back to their corporate environment, and this becomes basically a wide open access point for people not only being able to compromise the AWS environment, but being able to get into a corporate network, which may be a flat network, and then they can just kind of go to town on the rest of the company. In fact, we talked to someone who wanted us to alert whenever that condition actually occurred because it's something that had bitten them a few times. That's a very extreme example of where you have a team of developers that's out doing the agile thing, making stuff happen, but maybe don't quite understand the implications of their actions, and having a picture, having something that shows them what they've done can be really valuable. What other questions?
So one more. So can you speak regarding automation, the future of automation with exposure management?
Yeah, so the question was the future of exposure management with automation. Yeah, so I kind of alluded to it earlier that as you start to work through a continuous deployment process, if you're doing continuous integration where you're testing prior to committing code into production, then you have an opportunity now to run a battery of security tests in that staging or integration environment, wherever you're running those tests, prior to actual deployment. And what we actually do is we've kind of eaten our own dog food. We run that process as part of our continuous deployment process, and we have a set criteria of anything greater than a sort of medium risk issue fails the build, and it goes back to the developer for remediation, and they can try again, basically. But that's the type of process that we'd like to see more and more customers adopt, is stop the problem before it ever hits production.